Well, here we go again. Welcome, folks, to week number 37 on our Chronological Bible-in-a-Year reading challenge. If you've kept with me all year thus far, congratulations, well done, I'm proud of you. Look how far you've made it. This week, we're going to be finishing off the Book of Ezekiel, unless you snuck those last few chapters in last week's readings. Also, the Book of Joel, and our last major prophet, the prophet Daniel. There is far more to the Book of Daniel than the story of the lion's den. Daniel prophesied generations ahead of himself as to what is in the future for God's people Israel. But I'm not going to spoil it for you. In the meantime, sit back, relax, and enjoy today's tutorial. Alright, hi there everyone. Welcome to another weekend and another weekly tutorial as I endeavour to take you through the Bible in a year. Here's my Bible reading plan. As you can see, we are well and truly into it. We are, well there you go, week number 37 this week. So only a couple more weeks to go and then we hit Christmas, alright? Or Matthew chapter 1. Anyway, alright, we'll get there soon. This week we're meant to be finishing off the Book of Ezekiel before we get into Joel and the Book of Daniel, alright? I've got quite a bit to say about Daniel today. I won't say anything about Ezekiel because I've done 2 videos on him already, so if you missed those, just go back a bit and watch the last couple of videos. Joel is really simple, alright? He's a minor prophet, 3 chapters, but just because it's only a small book, it doesn't mean Joel is insignificant. In fact, he is very famous. He is the prophet that is quoted by the Apostle Peter on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, where he says, "I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh." So Joel is an important prophet, even though he's only 3 chapters. There's a whole bunch of stuff I could say about Joel, but there's really only one thing I want to bring to your attention or ask you to really pay attention to, and it's a repeated phrase that Joel uses. We've seen other prophets use it as well, but Joel uses it 5 times in just those short 3 chapters, and it's the phrase, the day of the Lord. All right? The day of the Lord. A couple of things to say about the day of the Lord that we see in other prophets and here in Joel as well. Number 1 and 2, the day of the Lord is something that is both very physical and very practical, but also spiritual. And because of that, it is described in language very practically, but also very poetically. And we see that in Joel, as we've seen that in the other prophets. In a physical sense, the day of the Lord basically describes a physical destruction on a physical city and a physical people at a real time and place in history by a real physical army or military force. That is what is physically, literally happening with the day of the Lord, and we see that in Joel. However, it's called the day of the Lord because there is also a spiritual implications. Behind the scenes, the Lord himself is orchestrating this disaster. All right, so that's why it's both physical and spiritual. The spirit realm has something to do with the political situation that is unfolding in the disaster known as the day of the Lord. And so that's why when you read about the day of the Lord, they are described in both practical terms, an army coming, laying siege to the city, putting people to death by the sword, all right, famine coming because people can't get food, murder, rape, pillaging, plundering the temple, burning down buildings, destroying walls, okay, the destruction of the city, the burning up of a land, all right? It's described in narrative text, particularly in very practical ways. But it is also described by the prophets in very poetic terms, very exaggerated language. And Joel does that this week. He describes the day of the Lord, the physical destruction of a city by a real physical army that God is orchestrating behind. He describes that as the stars falling from heaven and the moon turning dark and the sun no longer shining and the whole earth quaking under the pressure of what's happening, all right? Those aren't literal things that are taking place. When these wars happened, there was no physical, literal stars falling from the sky. The physical, literal moon did not turn dark. It is poetic language used to describe what is going on in these battles, all right? And we've seen this time and time again, but Joel particularly brings this to the fore, and so I want you to pay attention to that this week. And I thought about it as I read this week. You know, probably the closest modern day example we have of this is when someone goes through a really hard time, suffers a major trauma in their life, the death of a loved one or a child or something really, really traumatic. You'll often hear people say something like, "My world got turned upside down. The day that happened, that tragedy happened, my world came to an end." All right, my whole universe was turned on its head. All right, you hear people say this type of phrase. That's what's happening with the day of the Lord. That's what the prophets are communicating in poetic language, a very, very real and physical thing. All right, so that's Joel. Just pay attention to that one thing. And then, here we go. You hit the book of Daniel. Everybody's favorite book, all right? Daniel is an incredible book because in some parts of it are really easy to understand. They're the most popular Sunday school kids lessons you can have, all right? Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel's special vegetarian diet, all right? All that stuff is in there in the book of Daniel, and yet there's also some passages that have confused and people and led to great discussion and dialogue and debate and disagreement for centuries and will continue to do so. So Daniel is a real mixed bag. He's 12 chapters and he covers a span of 70 years of history. That's really important to note. All right. Daniel started, the story of Daniel begins when he was a teenager and he was part of the first wave of captives to Babylon. Remember, Ezekiel was part of the second wave. Jeremiah was there during the third and final conquest. Well, Daniel goes right back to 606 BC. He is the part of the first wave of captives to Babylon and ends up working for King Nebuchadnezzar, much like Joseph, all right, in Egypt, in the book of Genesis, you're going to notice a lot of similarities between Daniel and Joseph. Now that I've told you, hopefully you see them this week. So here we go with the book of Daniel. 12 chapters over 70 years. And in that period of time, incidentally, he has at least three different kings that he is serving. Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and then Darius and Cyrus, who may actually be two names for the same person. Not quite sure. But anyway, he serves a number of different kings. And what is a little bit confusing about Daniel, and I need to give you a warning for this, is again, it's a prophetic book that is not written chronologically. All right, so every now and again, a chapter will start with a timestamp. And what Daniel does is he jumps back and forth through different kings, through different phases of history as he tells the story. If you want to do what I did this week and read Daniel chronologically, down in the notes here on YouTube, I'll put the chapter orders so you can read it as it happened, all right? If you want to do that. But basically, Daniel, while it is not chronological, does split nicely into two halves. And so it's probably the best way to read it. Read it in two halves. The first half is all about stories. It's narrative, all the popular stories that you know of Daniel. And it talks about Daniel in the third person. It talks about things that happened to a guy called Daniel. The last 6 chapters are all prophecy and dreams and visions and are largely written in the first person. I, Daniel, saw this. In fact, what's interesting as well is the first half is mostly written in the language of the Babylonians, Aramaic. The second half is mostly written in the language of the Hebrews. The Hebrew people. So it really does split nicely into two halves. There's a whole lot of stuff I could say about Daniel in 12 chapters, and I personally went through down a whole bunch of rabbit trails as I was studying this week, so I'm not going to go through those with you today. I just want to leave you with 4 things to pay attention to as you read. Sorry, I need a drink. As you read Daniel this week. Here we go. Firstly, Daniel gives us a real big picture overview of what's going to be happening in political history for the next few hundred years. You're going to see that. It's really quite clear. While Babylon, we've seen the rise of Babylon as the world empire of that part of the world anyway. Babylon's empire will come down and the Medes and the Persians will rise. They will come down when the Greeks arise, Alexander the Great. They will come down when the Romans arise. And so we see this big picture view pointing all the way to where the kingdom comes in the age and era of Christ. All right, big picture view. Daniel gives that to us, really, really helpful. Gives us an idea of what's coming into the future. The second thing I want to give you, ask you to pay attention to is Daniel's insight, not only into the political world, but the spiritual world. And he sees this real tie, again, like the day of the Lord, between what's happening politically or literally and how that is led by what's happening in the spirit realm. And he has dialogues with basically members of what we've seen before is the divine council, with little g gods, okay, with angels, basically, rulers in the heavenly place. And it seems that Daniel shows us that Persia, okay, has its own ruler in the spirit realm. Greece has its own ruler in the spirit realm. And the ruler given to Israel at this point of history is a guy called, or an angel called Michael. Okay, which is good news, because while God himself has left Israel, the glory of God has left them at this point in history, God has not left them alone. He has appointed an angel over them to guard them and guide them and to take care of spiritual business on their behalf. And so Daniel gives us insight into all this. It reminded me of Moses way back in Exodus 33 when the people worship a golden calf and God says, that's it, I will no longer be with you, but I'll assign an angel to go before you. And Moses says, no, an angel's not good enough for us, God. We want you. Well, it seems in this part of history, God has left his people, in a sense. His glory has departed, says Ezekiel, but he's not left them on their own. They have an angel in the spirit realm who is contending for them. So, what's my point? Daniel, like Ezekiel, can really see what's going on in the spirit realm. That's the second thing I want you to take notice of. The third thing I want you to notice is that after Babylon falls, because in that 70 years Daniel prophesies, it's the 70 years where Babylon, Jeremiah prophesied Babylon's reign would come to an end. Daniel is there to witness that, all right? And Gabriel, another angel, meets him to say that yes, Jerusalem will be restored. Yes, the city walls and the temple will be rebuilt. But he also prophesies, can you believe it, of another devastation, another destruction, another day of despair or days of despair coming for God's people into the future. So even though there will be a restoration, even though the first wave remnant goes back to Jerusalem under Zerubbabel while Daniel is alive and prophesying, he sees that happening. Daniel turns to Jerusalem and begins to pray in that direction during that time, all right? While that's happening, we learn that there will come yet another destruction upon Jerusalem and another desecration of their temple some point into the future. So the utopian idea of a new heaven and a new earth and the whole thing about there never being a war and God's people always being protected doesn't seem to be coming in this next period of time. More devastation, more destruction is on the way. As if we haven't had enough of that already. And finally, I want you to pay attention to a phrase that's fairly new. Moses actually mentions it in Deuteronomy, but it comes up, I think, about 5 or 6 times as the angels are talking to Daniel. And it's this phrase, the time of the end. Okay, the time of the end. Not the end of time, okay, but the time of the end. A bit like Joel prophesying the day of the Lord. He repeats this phrase. So this phrase is repeated not from Daniel, but to Daniel from heaven, the time of the end. And in fact, a lot of the prophecy that he is given, the visions that he's given into the future, one of the angels says to him, listen, seal it up, keep it hidden. People will not understand this until the time of the end. I wonder what that could be. The end of what and who at some point in future will be found worthy to open those scrolls again. We can only wait and see. Guys, there's so much more I can say about Daniel. Really hope you enjoy him this week. As I said, I suggest you read him in 2 halves. The first 6 and the last 6 chapters. Do it like that. Joel, of course, you can read in one sitting. And please don't get too lost in all the details and the rabbit trails. Just know that with Daniel, there are some prophecies that are so specific. We can look back in history and know exactly when they came about. And other prophecies are less specific, more broad, and still today cause a lot of debate, dialogue, disagreement, and discussion. And you know what? That's okay. That's not the purpose of these videos. Bless you guys. Enjoy your readings. I'll catch you next week. And we are only a couple of weeks away from heading on into the 1st century New Testament scriptures. Bless you lots. I'll see you soon. Bye. That's it for today's lesson. I really hope you enjoy your readings this week. Remember, allow yourself time to read as much as you can in one sitting. Don't get lost in the detail. Just keep going and watch the Bible's big story unfold before you. Remember also to hit me up on our social media channels or website, and I'll see you next time.